Good morning. It was 4th of July weekend, and the family had gathered for a big meal together. In the kitchen was 4-year-old little Johnny, and there on the edge of the counter sat one of the things that he loved the most. It was a big, round, juicy watermelon, and he just couldn't stop staring at it. He was just keyed in on this thing. But everyone told little Johnny to leave it alone, that Mom and Dad would cut it up later and we'd all enjoy it. It was explained that it would be too hard for him to lift. It was too heavy for him, and if he tried to lift it, he would drop it, and it might split open on the floor. But so everybody supposed that he understood the danger of messing with the watermelon, and everybody went on about their business. And that is until there was a loud thump later on in the kitchen, and there it was. The watermelon was split open right there on the floor, like they had warned him, cracked right down the middle. And everyone turned and saw what had happened. You could sense the various feelings of the people there, and the adults, the disappointment, frustration, surprise, anger. But before anyone could do or say anything, the 4-year-old looked up and said, "Well, I never saw that coming." Now, why did the little boy do what he did? He did what he did because he wanted that watermelon. He just wanted it now. He couldn't understand why the object of his affection would be denied him. For that little boy, that watermelon represented pleasure. But when he attempted to take hold of this pleasure, everything just crumbled. It fell apart. And that's what Solomon is going to be talking about to us today here in Ecclesiastes chapter 2, starting at verse 1. He's telling us that he sought to take hold of pleasure in his life, but when he did, everything fell apart. Ecclesiastes 2, starting at verse 2, says, "What does pleasure accomplish?" And later on, skipping to verse 10, he says, "I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. My heart took delight in all my work, and this was the reward for all my labor. Yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless. It was a chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun." And Solomon also goes through a long list of things that he had done to find pleasure. He tried to find pleasure in accomplishments. He built houses and planted vineyards. He made gardens and parks and planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. And he made reservoirs to water all of his trees. And this is all plural. These are multiple different gardens, multiple different houses that he built. It was glorious. It was wonderful. Yet he found that none of those accomplishments brought him pleasure. And he tried to find pleasure in his possessions. He had slaves. He owned herds and flocks. He hoarded silver and gold and all kinds of treasure. He was a man of great wealth. But none of those possessions brought him pleasure either. He even tried wine, women, and song, yet that didn't work. At the end of experimenting with all those pursuits to seek pleasure, it's almost as if Solomon just sighed, just completely disappointed, slumped over, and he said, "Everything is meaningless. It's all a chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained." Now, it helps to know that these were not just errant musings by Solomon. He actually has a purpose in telling us this. This is all in hindsight of his life and what happened. And he has a purpose in telling us his failures to pleasure himself. But before we get into examining exactly what Solomon is trying to get at here, we need to begin with one basic biblical truth and that truth is there is nothing wrong with pleasure. There's nothing wrong with pleasure. God designed us to have pleasure in this world. In fact, when God created Adam and Eve, he prepared a special place for them to live. And what is the name of that place? It's very famous. It was the Garden of Eden. And the word Eden, the very word Eden, means pleasure. Eden means pleasure. When God created Adam and Eve, he created a place for them to have pleasure, and pleasure in God. In Psalm 36, verses 7 through 8, David wrote this praise of God. How precious is your loving kindness, O God. Therefore the children of men put their trust under the shadow of your wings. They are abundantly satisfied with the fullness of your house. And you give them drink from the river of your pleasures. God loves us so much that he wants to satisfy us. And he wants to let us drink from the river of his pleasures. So there's nothing wrong with wanting pleasure in your life. In fact, in Psalm 16, verses 11, David praises God with these words. You will show me the path of life. In your presence is fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures forevermore. God wants to give us pleasure, but what exactly is pleasure is the question. I looked at a few resources and found the different synonyms of pleasure: satisfaction, enjoyment, delight, happiness, joy, contentment. Did you realize that one of God's objectives when he saved you was to give you pleasure, to give you true pleasure, to give you enjoyment, to give you satisfaction, contentment in this world? The problem for many Christians is that we look in all of the wrong places for that pleasure. As Christians, we live in the world, and so there are times that we think like those of the world. Basically, we've been surrounded by a pagan world for so long that we tend to think like pagans sometimes. So the Bible gets right to the heart of things. It gives you the secret of joy and contentment and pleasure. It gives you the key to satisfaction and happiness in this world. So do you want to know what the key for pleasure and happiness is? And do you want to know what that secret is for joy and contentment? Well, Paul tells us that he discovered it, that he found it. He wrote, I've learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. He discovered the secret of being content. And do you want to know what the secret is? Rejoice in the Lord always. I will say it again, rejoice. Philippians 4:4. That's it. That's all there is. Sermon over. Rejoice in the Lord always. That's the secret of being content in any and every situation. That's it. That can't be all there is to it. It can't possibly be that simple, right? Did you notice that Paul also repeats himself here? He says, rejoice in the Lord always, and then he says it again. He said, I'll say it again, rejoice. Why is Paul repeating himself? Why does he have to say it twice? Well, he's repeating himself for the same reason parents often have to repeat themselves. And I'm getting many smiles from parents right now. Have you noticed that parents do that? Zeke, have you noticed that? They say things like, if I've told you once, I've told you 1,000 times, right? They'll say, and this is me, they say, I'm not going to tell you again to clean your room. And me being the sassy child, you just said it again. You know, that's why they have to say it. But because they have to repeat themselves because the kids aren't paying attention. They're not. They have to repeat themselves because the kids, at first, they don't think what their parents are saying is important. Cleaning their room, they don't recognize the significance of that. They don't recognize why that is important and what that will entail for the rest of their lives. And so the parents repeat themselves to emphasize that it is important. And that's why Paul repeats himself here in Philippians 4. What he's saying just seems too easy. It seems too simple. You couldn't possibly gain happiness through rejoicing, could you? And because it seems so easy and so simple, a lot of folks often overlook it. I read an article by an atheist who made an interesting observation. Over the years, she says, I've come to think I'm missing out. My friends and my relatives who rely on God, the real believers, not just the churchgoers, have an expansiveness of spirit. When they walk along beside a stream, they don't just see water falling down rocks. The sight actually fills them with ecstasy. They see a realm of hope beyond this world. I just see a babbling brook. I don't get the message. What the atheist is seeing in the real believers was a spirit of rejoicing. The real believers had seen something that she did not, and that is one of the real problems for people that are not content. They don't see what we see as believers. And even as believers, we forget sometimes, if we're being honest with ourselves. A wealthy man stopped at a travel agency one time, and he said he wanted to go on a cruise. This was not during the coronavirus season. And the man said, "Where to?" He said, his reply was, "I don't know." Realizing this man was extremely wealthy, the travel agent suggested that he take a look at a large globe that was in the room. And if you can find a place that interests you, I can get you on a cruise there, the agent said. So the man went over the globe and he studied it for some time, spinning it and analyzing it. And after a while, he looked up in frustration and exclaimed, "Is this all you have to offer?" Unhappy people are often unhappy because they're never satisfied with what they have. They could have the whole world at their fingertips and they still would not be content. And that's because they've never learned to rejoice in what they have already. Biblically, rejoicing is not so much an emotion. It is a conscious decision to be happy with what you have. Those who don't consciously decide to rejoice will never be happy no matter what they have, in all honesty. If you gave the average person a tablet of paper and asked them to write down the things that disappoint them in life, that frustrate them about their life, or the things that they wish they had but didn't, they could fill out the entire tablet pretty quick and ask for another. But if I gave them a single sheet of paper, just one sheet of paper, and asked them to fill out, to just write down 10 things that they were thankful for, they couldn't do it. They would struggle to do that. Why? Because they're not used to being thankful for what they have. Why should they be thankful for their hands? I've always had 2 hands. Why should they be thankful for being able to see? I've always been able to do that. I've always been able to see. Why should we be thankful for being able to walk or talk or sing or dance? They've always been able to do those things. But they can't reach those other things, those things that are more elusive, and it disappoints and it frustrates them because they don't have them. And that's what makes them unhappy. They focus on what they don't have rather than what they do have. That's part of the reason Solomon was so frustrated in the fact that his accomplishments, his possessions, and his entertainment life, he has all those things. In fact, those items are pretty easy for a man in his position and power and possessions to obtain. Thus, nothing that he mentioned was capable of giving him pleasure, because he's not learned to be satisfied and happy with what he had. But there's one more aspect to his frustration on Solomon's part with pleasure. Paul said, I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. Do you remember what I said the secret was? It's rejoice in the Lord. You see, in all his discussion about seeking pleasure, Solomon hadn't mentioned God once. And I believe he did that on purpose. Because at the very end of the book of Ecclesiastes, he says this, now all has been heard. Here is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. Ecclesiastes 12:13. The conclusion of the matter, says Solomon. The reason everything else seems so empty and worthless and boring in life is because you haven't included God in the picture. He's not a part of it. If God is not the center of your joy, life is going to be empty. One of the scholars that writes in the Jewish Encyclopedia says, no language has as many words for joy and rejoicing as does the language of Hebrew. In the Old Testament, there are 27 different words used primarily for some aspect of joy or joyful participation in religious worship. In contrast to the rituals of other faiths in the East, he says Israelite worship was essentially a joyous proclamation and celebration. The good Israelite regarded the act of thanking God as the supreme joy of his life. Pure joy is in God as both its source and its object. As the psalmist says in Psalm 16:11, you have made known to me the path of life. You will fill me with joy in your presence, with eternal pleasures at your right hand. Where's the joy? It's in his presence. Where is the eternal pleasures? It's at his right hand. If you recall what I told you that Paul wrote, he had found the secret of contentment. And I told you that the secret was to rejoice in the Lord always. But that phrase is actually the opening statement for Paul in discussion of how a Christian should rejoice. Then Paul ends that section with these words of what was truly the secret of his contentment. He says in Philippians 4:12-13, I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. And here's the good part. He says, I can do all this through Christ who gives me strength. You see what Paul is saying? He's saying that it is Jesus who gives him contentment. It is Jesus who gives him joy and pleasure in life. That's because without Jesus, there is no lasting contentment. It is Jesus who gives him joy and pleasure. But Paul realizes he could do everything through Christ who gave him strength. Commenting on Ecclesiastes, Chuck Swindoll noted the fact that Solomon went through a whole list of things that should give life purpose, but they simply don't. In the end, Solomon repeats again and again, over and over, it's all emptiness, it's all meaningless, it's all a chasing after the wind. So Swindle wrote, "If there's nothing but nothing under the sun, our only hope must be above it." Our true hope for meaning in this world lies above this world, not in it. We never will find lasting pleasure in this world. I've learned this lesson the long and hard way myself, and I'm still learning it. There's lots of room for improvement. I remember a time in my life where I did the same thing as Solomon on a much smaller level. I was bored with life. I was bored with church tradition. It wasn't cutting it for me anymore. And I was tired of being a back row sitting Christian, just sitting my way, daydreaming through a service. I was tired of working a simple job at Chick-fil-A, and I was tired. It had lost its luster. I was tired of not having money, and I wanted nice things. Why can't I have nice things like these rich people across town? And that was the point in my life where I decided it would be better to go and chase money and power than to live for Christ. I said, I'm going to go be a bartender, and I'm going to go make the big bucks. I'm going to go and chase money. I'm going to go chase pleasure. I'm going to gain position in society. And I just decided whenever things would lose their luster, whenever I would get bored, I would just add a new thing to the list. I would embrace it all. I would not deny myself anything, whether that be drugs, alcohol. I'm just going to embrace it because maybe I can find some lasting pleasure partaking in these things. Maybe I can fill the void that has always been there. And you know what? I did have a good time for a while. I really did. To the world, I was doing pretty dang well too, looking from the outside in. I had lots of money. I had a nice car. I had fancy clothes. And I was well known in the community. But to every high, there's also a coming down. And I remember how empty I felt in those moments when it did wear off, where the money was not enough, the next high was not enough. And it was not until I came back to faith, my faith was renewed, and I started to repair that relationship that I had neglected for so long. And I went to Bible college where I started to mend my relationship with Jesus, with God, and I learned how to find true joy again. I remember when this first kind of practically played out in the workplace. The workplace was where I struggled the most in life because I wanted to achieve everything. I wanted to be better than everyone. I wanted to show that I was number one. And man, how quickly you get humbled in life. And but I remember I was working at Sky Ranch. This is my first summer back being a practicing Christian, being a practicing believer. And I was working on the maintenance team. And I quickly found out there would be trying times as a Christian at a Christian camp, just like my old jobs. It would try my patience. And there would be times where I would get bored. It would get monotonous. And I would be tempted. Very hard. I believe the devil was on my back trying to get me to turn right back where I came from. And I found that Christians at Christian camp can get on each other's nerves too. You know, surprise, surprise. There was one day in particular, however, I remember this was right smack dab in the middle of the summer when everybody is stressed out and tired and you've worked long and hard. Maintenance team, you're in the heat and you're frustrated. But this day, it seemed like everything went wrong. People were making mistakes, things were breaking, and I was also sleep deprived. So after this day, when everything seemed to go south, I was frustrated. I was mad. I thought this day has been a waste. This day was useless. But I needed a release. But instead of running back to the old vices, a pack of smokes or a bottle, I decided I would go on a drive. I got in the Sky Ranch maintenance truck and I drove, and I decided I would go get away for a little bit because everybody else was going to go to Brahms and Joplin and go hang out. And I decided, that's not what I need right now. I need to go spend time with God for a little bit. I had neglected Him. Me and Him need some one-on-one time. So I made a drive out to the far pasture on camp, and it was beautiful. God really blessed me that night. He knew what I needed. It was a crisp 75 degrees outside with the windows rolled down, and I drove up that gravel lot, headed down that winding road up to the pasture, and the stars were starting to come out. It was getting dark. Nightfall was coming, and I feel like God He knew it. The timing was perfect. The sun went down. The stars were beautiful, shining out. And as I pulled up through the drive, there were just fireflies, thousands of them, just lighting right above the grass. And I was just filled with peace. God was speaking to me through His creation, giving me pleasure in that moment, ecstasy, and being in His presence, knowing that it all came from Him, and that He knew I needed my soul to be calmed after that day. And I finally parked the truck and just sat there and in silence, just listening and talking to God. And that was one of the most refreshing moments, I would say, of my life. And I remember driving back to camp. Everybody was back there, and I guess I had lost track of time, and it was midnight, and I got back, and I was just so happy, just so filled with joy and satisfaction, and it lasted into the next day. There was no hangover, there was no regret, there was nothing. I was very happy that I did what I did, and it gave me lasting joy. I want to end with this last illustration. It was nighttime, and a huge fireworks display lit up the sky. A man told of noticing a small boy about 3 years old perched on his father's shoulders. The child sat mesmerized, aware only of what was exploding in the heavens. When the fireworks were over, the little boy looked out into the sky again, and he said, "Thank you, God." Of course, we realized that God did not shoot off those fireworks, but this small child had learned the value of thanking God, even for the works of men. And it was in that thankfulness that he showed the beauty of a grateful heart. That was why he was filled with wonder and joy as he watched the fireworks display. That little boy put God at the center of his joy. And that's what we all need to do if we truly want to find pleasure in our lives. But you can't have that joy truly until you're in your life until you have Jesus. So please join with me in continually thanking God for our many blessings and thanking God for providing all the joy we need in life. So So let me pray for us. God, thank you so much for giving us pleasure, for providing all the joy that we need, God. The elusiveness of finding pleasure in earthly things, God, I pray that it does nothing but draw us closer to you, knowing that you are the only one that will truly provide what we need. I pray that you be with us throughout this week. In your name I pray. Amen.